This is the Content Strategy Insights podcast, episode number 132. I usually prepare pretty thoroughly for these interviews. This episode's a little different. I had scheduled a Zoom chat with Ethan Marcotte to noodle on an idea that had recently occurred to me about responsive content design. As we started our conversation, we agreed that it might be worth recording. It definitely was. As usual, Ethan was a font of insights and ideas about designing great experiences and building systems that support their creation.
Welcome to the Content Strategy Insights podcast, where accomplished content strategy experts share their wisdom with our friends in the content community. Our mission is to democratize content strategy, to make its principles and practices accessible to everyone. And now, here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hey everyone, welcome to a special episode of the Content Strategy Insights podcast. I woke up a few weeks ago with this crazy idea in my head, and I said, I know a guy who might be able to help me noodle on this. So I'm talking today with Ethan Marcotte. You might remember Ethan. He started this thing called responsive web design. What was like 11 or 12 years ago now?
Yeah, back in the Stone Age, I think. Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah.
Well, and the reason I wanted to talk to you about this, because it seems like we're at some kind of maybe analogous juncture in, like back then, I think it was mobile and just the need to have designs work on different devices and in different contexts. There's stuff going on in the content world now with personalization and the need for omnichannel strategies and these kinds of things that are it just anyhow. When I woke up with that idea of responsive content design, I think that's what was going on. I honestly have no idea what I was thinking about, but anyhow, I just wanted to noodle on that with you. So maybe can you tell me a little bit about where responsive web design came from, like how that?
I can give you my level best, Larry. But man, it started pretty early on in my career when I read this really great essay by John Alsop called "A Doubt Web Design," and in it he was basically talking about how the web as a design medium was kind of at a weird tension point because it was sort of like following on from centuries of graphic design in the printed page, and he was basically saying here's this brand new medium. And what we're trying to do from a design perspective is trying to replicate the constraints of the page, right? Like we're drawing fixed little boxes on the screen, filling them with content and imagery and stuff like that, but more or less treating it like it's an extension of Photoshop or Illustrator. And so he was basically arguing the web is this completely flexible design medium. We can't control when or how somebody's going to access our content. They could be on a massive monitor, a tiny one. They could have really poor internet connection, and we have to sort of think more flexibly as designers. We have to plan for that flexibility. But he wrote this back in 2000, I think, and the tools that we had for web design were pretty rudimentary. So when I coined the term responsive design, it was basically sort of again, mobile, as you said, it was kind of exploding. And so I was just we now have the technology to kind of capitalize on this old idea of thinking about the web more flexibly. So why not think about experiences that could be shown to somebody on desktop or on mobile or any kind of device that they have, and really just think about one flexible experience that can, respond to the changing environment that it's in. So that's kind of how it started.
It occurs to me now that you were probably thinking about content as part of that, or was that an explicit part of that at all? Or
I mean, I'm a designer by trade, and I think it wasn't explicit in that, it wasn't a big formal part of the article when I coined the term, but it was really something we need to stop thinking about mobile users and desktop users as having dramatically different needs by default simply because they have differently sized screens. We want to share the same information, the same content with anybody. The first large scale responsive redesign was the Boston Globe's website, which I was a design lead on, part of a large team, but I was involved with it. And we pretty much very quickly decided your readership is coming to your website at multiple points of the day with different kinds of devices, right? That they are trying to read articles. They don't necessarily care about what articles are available to them when they're on mobile, or they don't want to track what's available to them when they're sitting at their desktop at work. They really just want to have access to the Boston Globe's information. So yeah, I mean, content was treated as a first citizen, maybe not in a formal way, but it was basically everyone wants the same information regardless of the device that they have.
You're reminding me now too. I can't remember exactly when it was, but I'm always surprised at how early it was when NPR did their create once, publish everywhere model.
Right.
That was in the
Right.
air at that same time as well.
Yeah.
And I've always been surprised at how little, how little that I was hoping that would explode, but it really didn't
Right.
right away. But responsive
Right.
web design did explode.
Yeah.
That just became
Yeah.
a thing.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. And it's interesting because I definitely remember, maybe I've been hanging out with Karen McGrain too much, but like I feel like the COPE model was something that was talked a lot about at that time. But folks definitely were pretty excited about responsive design. I will say that one of the things that was really helpful in conversations, both with the Globe, but every client that I've worked with since, is this idea of like designing for mobile first. Because I think like responsive design was kind of like counter to this idea that we have to like present a slimmed down view of our design and our content to folks simply because they're on a smaller screen. And a very smart man named Luke Wroblewski basically said, like, we're doing that simply because we're starting from a desktop context and then trying to make everything fit on mobile. Instead, our audiences are becoming more mobile focused. They're becoming predominantly mobile only. So why not treat mobile as a first-class citizen? Why don't we start there and think about what's the information that's best for the small screen user, and then kind of use that as our foundation. So that at least for me has always been like the one of the ingredients of a really successful responsive redesign is thinking about like what's the information that's most valuable to your users, and working from a mobile context. And then using that to kind of like build consensus around how that's going to look on tablet, on desktop, or any kind of device.
That's it. All of a sudden I'm thinking about like things like accessibility, that like by designing for people who have extra needs, that like it's a better experience for everyone. And it seems like that mobile first approach may have had something like that. Is that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, like accessibility for me has just been like it's a sign of a job done right. I think it's really about thinking about I don't know. It's I would say like mobile first and an accessible experience are similar in that like you're trying to think about experiences outside your default view of working from the web. So like I've got a decent laptop and a decent monitor and a decent internet connection. My body can do certain things. And the way that I design a website is kind of informed by all those things. But the concept of thinking about mobile first is, okay, what if somebody is working with a screen that's like 80% smaller than the one that I have, or maybe they're on a spotty network connection? Simply by thinking about those use cases, it's going to make the experience better for everybody because everyone's going to benefit from something that's built to be lightweight and nimble and deliver as fast as possible. Something that's going to have content that's tailored to a small screen. As you expand out from that, it's still going to feel very focused and new. So, I think absolutely accessibility is sort of part of that in terms of like thinking about just a broader range of uses, and it's going to improve the design for everybody.
Yeah, and it's as you were talking, also maybe also think about like just the kind of shift from over the years, like especially in the content world, many if not most of us come out of like some kind of publishing background, and we're just about pushing information out there and having it formatted and thinking about it. I think in the world of UX, it's much more about task accomplishment and just getting the info you need to do whatever it is you want to do in that moment. And it seems like that could be, was that an organizing scheme in your responsive web design work?
No, that's a great question, Larry. I think measurement's a tough question. It's not something that was like a big focus because at the time, I was, just banging rocks together, trying to get this idea out. Because I think like since then, so many other folks have like really improved on the original article. There was a lot of like research done at the time, sort of like discounting this idea of like the mobile user, right? Like, we just sort of had like different device use cases that there are tablet needs and desktop needs or, mobile needs. And folks basically said like, we're talking to our users, we're actually running a significant amount of testing and it doesn't really play out. So, I think it was really like, for a lot of folks, responsive design was just kind of like a relatively inexpensive way to design an experience that's device agnostic. You could very easily start from a desktop context and start like hiding stuff as it gets down to smaller screens and still have a responsive website. But I think like from a UX perspective, that's going to be a subpar experience because again, by and large, audiences kind of want the same information regardless of where they are. So
Yeah,
yeah,
no, that makes a huge amount of sense. It's kind of like it's like an argument for human-centered design. Just start with like, what are you trying to do? Where are you at? How can I help you?
absolutely.
And we'll just
Yeah,
create the
absolutely.
experience that does that for you.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, definitely. Definitely. Yeah. I mean, I think that's, we're seeing so many like discoveries in the last like 5 to 10 years about like mobile only populations. And, especially those of us who might be in like a Western context, or, you and I were talking to the United States, like, um, there's sort of a temptation to think of mobile only users as being like in these far flung lands, but there's huge swaths of population in the United States that their only means of accessing the internet is over a spotty network connection on a mobile device. So the fact that we're not like focusing on that, I think, is like a big UX opportunity that folks can really capitalize on.
you're reminding me of my first. I didn't articulate it that way at the time, but I remember like back in the late '90s arguing with somebody about accessibility, and like, hey, why would you turn away X% of your audience just
Sure.
because they don't have like a fancy iPhone and a
Yeah.
good Wi-Fi connection?
Yeah.
That's an interesting one because you're
Yeah.
right that
Absolutely.
like as the web grows, we've been successful. But part of that success is like we have to
Mhm.
serve a whole bunch of different people, like people all over Africa with just phones, maybe not even smartphones, but just text experiences and things like
Yeah.
that. That seems, and I guess that's kind of what I was thinking about with the
Mm.
responsiveness. Like you want to respond to all of your customers wherever,
Mm.
yeah. But another thing that occurs to me too is that like, whereas back then, like 10 to 15 years ago, like mobile first was sort of a good paradigm to organize things around. Nowadays it seems like maybe conversation first might be a reasonable paradigm to build things around. I think of like not just chatbots and voice assistants and other voice interfaces, but just like it just seems like the web is getting more conversational, and I don't know how you make conversation responsive and scaly. Have you thought about that or?
Man, I haven't. I mean, that's a little bit outside my bailiwick. I will say that in recent years, as I've been doing more design systems works with organization, both in my design practice, and then since founding a consultancy with Karen McGrain and Jeff Eaton, we've been looking at sort of like how these organizations kind of get their information out there, and design systems are absolutely one part of that. But I think a lot of organizations have actually started thinking about some of these questions about like how they formalize design around non-visual media like conversation or like chatbots. What kind of conversational patterns do we need to plan for and design around? What kinds of modes of interaction do we want to sort of like capture around a conversation, regardless of whether it's predominantly oral, just over voice, or whether it's going to be in a typed context on a mobile device. So yeah, I think it's a huge opportunity for folks to kind of think about like how good design can kind of inform those experiences as well.
Yeah, and I've been thinking it's interesting, thinking about it from a content perspective, because I think when I think about content, it's just driving me nuts that I can't dig into like these big NLP driven conversation machines and see what's going on with the content in there. It's very machine learning and NLP driven. But at the same time, when you're delivering content like that, there's still the need to like align with your brand voice and tone, and to use the same language, just all those things that content strategists are concerned with. And I guess the point of that, I think maybe the point of that is that like there's this, with the increasing decoupledness of like, I'm starting to think of content as like a thing we do independently that to support like everything from a good old fashioned desktop web browser and a tablet and a phone, but also a voice assistant or a kiosk in a store, all those things. Does that?
Yeah, yeah. That really does resonate, Larry. I mean, I think like one of the things that Jeff Eaton is always very good about talking about in our workshops is, just some of the underlying concepts that underpin a company's like publishing system. So for a design system, like what are the nouns and verbs you're sort of like thinking about as you're designing these patterns? Like, what is this? What is the purpose of this component? Like, what is it going to help you achieve as a business? What is it going to help the user achieve? what is its kind of like, I guess, organizational role in a broader interface? Like, what is its purpose, basically? And I think that absolutely applies to, some of the interfaces you're talking about, like, regardless of whether it's a visual component or an audio-based one. I think it still needs to tie back into some sort of underlying meaning. I think that's absolutely a really critical organizing principle.
Yeah. And when you talk about like organizing principles and that kind of stuff, you're also one of the pioneers in design systems work and are doing a lot of that currently. And it seems like I'm just, again, thinking out loud here that like, I wonder if we're going to have to wait like another 10 years for the content management systems I'm dreaming of, because
Right.
it took 10 years to get like to design systems that are ensconcing the stuff that you conceived of. Maybe we're just going to have to be patient. What do you think? Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it's very possible. I mean, I think like design systems in general, just speaking from where I'm sitting, they're in an interesting state of flux, because I think like up until now, like most organizations sort of think of it as a design system as this like tightly controlled centrally managed library of interface components and design patterns that the rest of the organization kind of subscribes to. In recent years, organizations are starting to realize that like tight control doesn't necessarily scale across a wider organization, that instead you really need to start thinking about like, okay, what are the shared foundations that we can sort of deploy globally? And then maybe think about systems that can support other systems. So one line of business might have specific design needs that they just need to organize their own design system around, which is then still sort of informed by that central set of brand standards or foundational design patterns. So there's at least like, there's a conversation happening right now about systems that can kind of bend and flex in more useful ways, rather than thinking about like, okay, this tight level of almost sort of like software centric control may not necessarily actually give you the flexibility you need as an organization. So it's been really interesting to see that conversation happen and that shift start to happen.
And you just exploded my brain with some real meta-ness around responsive design system design. Sorry.
Yeah. It's a sign of quality. If you can slap the responsive or adjective on something, it's definitely now a little bit spicier than it was before. But I don't think it's responsive design systems so much as just like organizations recognizing that they need a little bit more room for experimentation and room for growth, because ultimately these systems do need to bend and flex, rather than simply thinking about them as like, big software releases. I mean, that model may work for some organizations, but for others where, one line of business might have a dramatically different market than another, they need to operate a little bit more autonomously. And I think it's really interesting to like pair a governing model for a design system with a specific organization. It's been, like I said, it's been cool to see that conversation happening.
Yeah, as you talk about that, I'm reminded that like there are no two organizations that are remotely identical. They're
Right.
Yeah, and so that need to just and that's like that's not really responsive. That's just like the way the world is. You just but I guess the whole point of my podcast is like about to democratize content strategy and content practice and content design practice, and it's like maybe best practices is a thing, but maybe it's just more about like figuring out how to develop the practices that are going to work for you and your organization. And you've done a way more consulting than I have. Does that mesh with your work in a bunch of different orgs?
Yeah, it absolutely resonates, Larry. I mean, I think like, one of the conversations that we try to have with organizations who are at some sort of transition point with their design system, or their publishing systems in general, is just kind of talk to them about the principles they bring to their work. So for me, that might be a set of design principles that an organization could then use to think about like, how do we talk about design as an organization? Like, how do we know if the feature that we're shipping or the interface component that we're releasing, how do we know if that measures up to our the measure of quality we demand as an organization? Like what is the design principle that we're sort of using to evaluate our work? And I think that having those guiding principles in place are really helpful for organizations who need kind of a compass, as they start like embarking on a broader roadmap, or they start iterating on their design system, because it's a good way to build that vocabulary internally to figure out like, how do we talk about the quality of what we're doing? I think it's incredibly useful.
Yeah, no, I love that, the way you articulate that as a principles-based thing. I think some organizations ensconce those principles in things like governance mechanism, things like that. Some places, I think it's just culture that guides that. Does that make sense? And I'm just trying to think of the implications I mean, that the implications of that are just all over the place for all of us in design and content.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. I mean, one of the things I've liked saying to organizations in the past is, they're starting to create a design system, and I think it's helpful to sort of point out that they already have a design system today. That's a set of products. They have interfaces. There's a set of design standards and brand standards. Those things may not necessarily be defined or explicit or captured somewhere, but that's still a system, right? You have all these interlocking parts that have relationships to each other, and understanding where those different contexts are and how they sort of like play together and why they work together is really helpful as you start to formalize some of those processes. So absolutely, that makes a lot of sense. Thinking about like where things are now, and talking about them a little bit more explicitly is really helpful.
Mm-hmm. And as you're saying that, I'm reminded of like how like emergent and discovery so much of this stuff is that it's like you're I think something you just said reminded of like the notion of ensconcing this stuff as like a system or governance policies or whatever, that like again, depending on the organization you're in, it's either like some places are game for dictatorial or not dictatorial, but more prescriptive kind of schemes, and others, like you used the word subscription earlier. I think often of design systems as like they're often either adopted or governed, but I think subscription is a great way to think about it, because it's like, hey, I created this neat system, do you want to subscribe to it? Is that kind of how you're thinking about that?
Yeah. I love that, Larry. I mean, I think like I really like that a lot, because I think every design system that I've worked on, there's this notion of like consumers, the folks that are working with the system, they're shipping products based on the system, that they are, basically like subscribing to the central system for updates. Then there's also a layer of contributors as well, who are managing the system, extending the system. And in some cases, I mean, those two classes might overlap, right? Like you might have folks that are working with the system, but also feeding contributions back up to the system based on market needs or audience needs or what have you. And again, kind of like understanding where those two different groups are and how they relate to each other and who's in those groups helps build a better system in general. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, systems as matchmaking mechanisms. It's kind of thinking of wait, well, yeah, no. Wait, hey, I'm going to go ahead and just stop recording on this, because this was just for folks who are watching, or if we end up airing this. Ethan and I decided we just wanted to chat about this. We thought, hey, let's capture it and see if it works as a podcast episode. So you may or may not see this in the wild, but thanks for indulging me in this experiment, Ethan.
Yeah, thank you, Larry. It was great talking with you as always.
Thank you for listening. If you can think of a friend who might enjoy this episode, please share it with them. And please join us again for our next content strategy interview.